Hello, I'm Brendan Donnelly. I'm the leader of the Rejoin EU party, and I'm introducing today, moderating, the latest edition of the Rejoin EU debate. I've got some very distinguished and eloquent colleagues with me here today, and I'd like to suggest to them a number of topics we can discuss. First topic I'd like to discuss is the remark of Matt Hancock before the COVID inquiry that planning for COVID was hampered by the need to devote resources to dealing with the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. That seems to me to be a very illuminating story. I remember being told by a senior civil servant in 2016 that one of the reasons why he was voting to remain in the European Union was that the British state didn't have the capacity to deal at the same time with Brexit and all the other tasks of government. He didn't know anything about the pandemic at the time. But it's not just a question of the sad consequences for the people who died unnecessarily of the pandemic. It's also an illustration, this seems to me, of the cultic nature of Brexit. Brexit isn't about doing things which are useful for the country. It's a goal in itself. Winston Churchill described a fanatic as someone who, when he's got what he wanted, has forgotten why he wanted it in the first place. And I think that Brexit is a very good example of that. There were a limited number of people who knew what they wanted from Brexit, which was to turn the United Kingdom into Singapore-on-Thames. They kept very quiet about it at the time, but now we're seeing some examples of their handiwork and aspiration. But I would like to ask my other members, my fellow members of Rejoin EU, were you as shocked as I was when you heard that Brexit was taking priority over pandemic preparations in those years, 2 or 3 years ago? Richard Hewison, what did you think?
I have to say, Brendan, I'm not shocked at all. And one of the reasons is I think sometimes we forget when we look back at 2020 how bizarre it appeared at the time. I don't think even the most hardened Brexiter at that particular time would have been too upset if Brexit had been delayed a bit given the circumstances. And the ruthless dogma with which Brexit was just pursued at that particular stage by the Johnson government, to me, was always a little bit strange. And yes, I think the government betrayed its trust to the people there. They had a priority that they should have dealt with. They chose to focus on their own dogma rather than people's lives. And very sadly, the consequences of that to me, do not seem surprising at all.
Jim Newell, what's your take on this? Were you shocked when you heard it?
Well, I was very shocked at the fact that the government decided to use its resources in that way. Yes, I mean, I think that was absolutely scandalous. But I suppose, like Richard, given that they were pursuing Brexit with such dogmatic ruthlessness, it was perhaps not very surprising. Brexit has been a complete and utter dogma, and very often I feel quite amazed when I think of how anybody could ever have imagined that Brexit could have had any other than the negative consequences that it has had. You know, anybody who studies elementary economics will be able to tell you that if you erect enormous trade barriers between yourself and your nearest trading partner, you're bound to be worse off in the end. There's somebody by the name of Ricardo who made this point very clear over 200 years ago when he talked about the theory of comparative advantage. Yes, it really is absolutely amazing.
John, I'd like to put a point to you in that context. We talked about the dogma of Brexiters, but there's also an element of uncertainty. There's also the thought, which I often detect in many Brexiters, that they know how lucky they were to get away with it in 2016. And therefore, they're always operating under the fear that something will come along and take it away from them. That's why they wanted Article 50 to be invoked so quickly. That's why it seems to me they were so hostile to the idea of any extension of the transition period. Aren't we dealing, in addition to the dogmatism, with a great uncertainty on the side of the Brexit battalions, which can strike out in unpredictable ways?
Yes, I believe we are. I mean, Brexit has been described as a crime scene. And basically, that's what it is. You know, we've had our rights taken away from us. I've had my identity taken away from me as a mixed nationality from conception, birth, education, employment from all over the EU. You know, we've had our citizenship taken away from us, in my view, illegally. It was done on the basis of a crime because Brexit was delivered basis on cash from Putin. This has been proven. The Brexiters keep saying, oh, no, it's not true. It's a crime scene. Now, take this on towards their attitude towards COVID. Oh, Britain knows best and Brits are best and everybody better than everybody else. Why do you assume that? Why does the UK always assume it's better than elsewhere? Surely, if you want to set a new law out, you look around the world and say which one's got the best one, or which elements of which of the ones that are on offer work best. Let's see if we can combine them and work sensibly in an iterative improvement system. Look at COVID. We lost over 200,000 people to this disease that died unexpectedly, or at least early. And maybe COVID wasn't the main cause, but it's certainly a contributing factor. We're on an island, like New Zealand. They could have closed the borders, but no, profit was far more important than people's lives. That's the reality of it. This is their mindset. It's them first, it's selfishness first, xenophobia and racism used to engage the people on the lower scale. But the real reason for Brexit was tax evasion.
Richard, can I bring you in there?
Yeah,
a lot of people are saying and thinking things along the lines that John's just set out, but there doesn't seem to be a political echo in this. It's not the Labour Party or even the Liberal Democrats who pick up this ball and run with it. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think John raised some quite valid points there. And I think, if I'm honest with myself, perhaps before 2016, maybe I was guilty about it. I'd look at other joke countries in the world like Berlusconi's Italy and the rubbish they went through, and I sort of smile and think, couldn't happen here. And of course, I was proved spectacularly wrong. And I have to say, if we think back to the actual facts at the time, I was really surprised that, as John suggested, the borders weren't shut. Because if you remember, January 31st, 2020, there was a big, midnight's come, we're out of the EU, we've controlled our borders. If I was a Brexiter, the first thing I would have done is shut the borders and said, well, look, this is how we protected ourselves from the pandemic. But this focus on profit, dogma, etc., I do feel damaged us very, very badly there. And of course, when we have a look at comparing the UK to Europe on COVID, we shouldn't be comparing that because it's not like with like. Europe is a continent where shutting the barriers down was very, very hard to do. We should compare ourselves to Japan, New Zealand, Australia, civilizations in a similar situation. And of course, the death tolls there, because they did take early action, much, much lower. And I hear lots of people say, oh, you can't compare us to New Zealand. New Zealand's quite small. And then I see other people say, oh, you can't compare us to Japan. Japan's much larger. So why is it that somehow the 25 million people in Australia and the 100 million people in Japan, they were just the right size to be protected, but an island with 60 million, somehow that was the wrong size. So, and I think we have to be honest and reflect back on what actually happened. And I really do wish the COVID inquiry does get to the heart of this. Certainly, I think Brexit was a big cause of taking the eye off the ball. I think that is indisputable. And I don't think we should react with, oh my goodness, we never suspected that, because the signs were there all along, in my view.
Yes. Still, you'll hear from various advocates of Brexit that one of the benefits of Brexit was the vaccine rollout being so much quicker, more effective than elsewhere. It was quite an effective success of the National Health Service, ironically, of which the Conservative Party isn't always a great fan. Another myth, which is sometimes propagated, is that support for Ukraine was only possible because of the United Kingdom being outside the European Union. Jim, do you see this as amounting to a sort of pattern whereby the benefits of Brexit are so evanescent, so fugitive, that it's necessary to invent half or quarter truths in order to defend Brexit today?
Yes, I think that's definitely the case. We hear half truths being invented all over the place, and I think that nowhere is that clearer in the case of the Labour Party in terms of its policy of wanting to make Brexit work. Its suggestion that it will somehow negotiate another deal with the European Union, which will give us all the benefits of being a member of the single market without actually being a member. Something which is an example of living in fantasy land, it seems to me, because it overlooks the fact that therefore you're either in the single market or you're not in the single market. It seems to me that when we get to the next general election and the Labour Party finds itself trying to peddle this line, it'll come a cropper very, very quickly, because it's again another example, as we saw back in the 2019 general election, of the Labour Party trying to be all things to all people, trying to appeal to both sides. Well, it won't satisfy die-hard Brexiteers who will simply say, well, you can't trust this man Starmer because he was a Remainer. And it's unlikely to satisfy Remainers either, who will feel extremely let down. So, yes, half-truths and lies abound, I'm afraid.
Yes, and that over-optimism can be found in another area I'd like to explore for a moment, which is the negotiation concerning rejoining the Horizon programme, which apparently isn't going as well as the government hoped. The government hoped that by accepting the Windsor framework, that would soothe any ruffled feathers on the European side, and it would be possible very rapidly to come to a favourable re-entry for the United Kingdom into Horizon. That does seem to me to be a not untypical British civil service story. There's a belief that at the back of people's mind, they do need us more than we need them, and they're always looking for an excuse to get us back in. Do you think that's a fair analysis, Richard?
When we had this Windsor framework, he was always touted, if we remember Rishi Sunak's enthusiasm for this newly discovered international market that is wonderful that Ireland was part of now. And I recall people saying, yes, and now Horizon's back on the agenda as well. I always actually thought that was just a little bit of PR fluff anyway. And what I'm surprised at is that people now seem to be genuinely surprised that that's not actually going to happen. And obviously for international, and let's put this back in perspective, right? We are in the middle of a global climate crisis. There has never been a time where world science has had to get together more than it has now in order to actually achieve things. So the whole issue of excluding British scientists from Horizon seems a really, really sad day to me that we couldn't come to some arrangement to actually put that back. And just going back to the point in terms of the vaccine rollout, again, yes, it was great that Britain was at the forefront of the vaccine rollout, and great that British scientists were there as well. What really annoys me, though, is Boris Johnson trying to claim credit for that. This fantasy that somehow during the COVID crisis, all these scientists were just sitting around watching Netflix in their underwear, scratching their heads, going, what should we do? While Boris Johnson and Priti Patel were down in the Downing Street labs putting together these wonderful vaccines. That sort of peddling of fantasy is just beyond the pale to me. I know I exaggerate a bit there, but to hear Johnson, you'd think that he saved the world while simultaneously keeping peace between Russia and Ukraine and holding the whole world together at the time. So, no, I'm not actually surprised that this deal went down. To be frank, I was surprised it was even touted as a potential advantage.
Well, it still seems to be on the table, but it's more difficult than the British government had hoped it would be, because I don't think anybody's in any doubt that there is a contribution that British science could make to the Horizon programme. It's just that our partners don't think that living up to the treaty obligations which we freely undertook is something that should be munificently rewarded in a spectacular sweetheart deal on Horizon. Have you been following the Horizon negotiations, John?
A little, yes. I mean, my point on this is simply that, the vaccine was released under EU rules. It was not under UK rules, special new rules. It was all done on the EU system. And then we look at Horizon. Well, what did we do? We were offered Horizon. We said, no, thank you, get stuffed. We've got 27 serious countries, or mostly serious countries, involved in this, and others outside the EU in the Horizon programme. You can't just turn a great big ship like that in 1 second. And why would they trust us after we've done this? We've got to prove ourselves first. We've got to first be worthy of being accepted. This is not Great Britain. This is Little Britain.
Yes, of course, the United Kingdom is a medium-sized power with certain advantages and disadvantages. Jim, is it your impression that in the years when we were in the European Union, we made best use of those advantages that we could bring to the European Union? Sometimes there's a view that the United Kingdom's contribution to the European Union was a uniquely successful one, and it's one that everybody's missing in continental Europe. Is that your impression? I know you spend a lot of time in Italy.
Yes. No, I would say the reverse, actually, Brendan. There's a very famous book written by somebody whose name escapes me for the moment, but it's about Britain's relationship with the EU, and the title or the subtitle is The Awkward Partner.
That was written by Stephen Wall. Stephen Wall, he wrote a book.
Okay. Well, thank you for reminding me of that. And basically, it refers to the idea that British political elites were never committed to the European Union as a project for European integration. They only ever joined the European Union because they thought it was expedient to do so, and was in Britain's immediate trading and security interests. And so consequently, British political parties were never able to play the sort of pedagogical function which political parties in Italy have always played. In other words, enabling their members and Italian citizens generally to see themselves as, yes, Italian citizens, but also European citizens. In Britain, it's always been the other way around, with people being encouraged to see themselves as either European or British, not being able to see themselves as both. Hence the infamous UKIP poster during the 2016 referendum, where they showed two flags, the Union Jack and the EU flag, and said to voters, which flag is yours, implying that if you had any sort of identification with Europe, you were somehow unpatriotic, almost a traitor, as it were, So no, and I think Britain has also had considerable difficulty in contributing positively to the European Union and European integration, thanks to its nature as a union state. Meaning that British political elites have never been able to reconcile themselves to the idea of having to govern in accordance with written constitutions and things of that nature, which they're completely unfamiliar with.
Exactly. There were people who said that when the United Kingdom left the European Union, that would be a boost to European integration. I was slightly skeptical about that because I was aware that there are differing views within the European Union, quite apart from the United Kingdom. But I think I've slightly changed my mind on that. I think the United Kingdom leaving the European Union has been a definite boost to European integration, which I personally welcome. Jim mentioned a magic word, security. Which we don't always talk a lot about in the European context. Perhaps we should talk more. John, there's been quite a lot about security, rather negatively over the past week or so, which is Brexit and Boris Johnson related.
Yes.
I asked if you were shocked about what Hancock had been saying. Were you shocked when you discovered that Boris Johnson had been frequenting a house under surveillance by the Italian security service for its Russian links?
Well, I remember seeing a video by I believe someone who used to be a monk about 7-8 years ago. I think it's something like that, with videos of Russian mounting and going on about Johnson going to these bunga bunga parties there. And this has since come out, and it's about that sort of time period. But no, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, look at the guy's profile. You know, he's lied from A to Z. He has a what is it? A rather different connection to the truth than everybody else. Believes that he's entitled to all sorts of stuff and the rules don't apply to him. His whole life's been run on lies. You know, and on the other side, you've got the real pusher of Brexit who started all this with his Nazi salutes and marching through the village that his school was in, reported to the headmaster and letters of disgust by his teachers to the headmaster about him. You know, these are the people that the UK decided to trust. You know, that to me, that says we've got a real serious national psychological problem here in England specifically.
Richard, can you talk a bit more about the specifically Russian aspect of this?
Yes.
Once again,
I have to just say, I do agree with John very, very strongly on a lot of these issues over Johnson. Indeed, gives me a great excuse, of course, to talk about why I'm standing in Uxbridge as the Rejoin EU candidate to try and highlight some of these lies that came up. Because I think there's a very important point that goes to the heart of the psyche. Time and time again, we have seen this sort of thing happen in our society, and our reaction has simply been to just brush it under the carpet and try and move on as quickly as possible. Now, let's remind ourselves about a few facts about Johnson's time in that particular house. He wasn't Prime Minister then, he was Foreign Secretary then. It was known during Theresa May's government that this was actually going on, and it was revealed on social media that this was going on. And indeed, looking at Twitter today, there are some interesting journalists on Twitter saying, why is everyone saying, I was talking about this in 2018, I was talking about this in 2017. Why is it just suddenly coming to the fore? And again, it's because of this desire perhaps not to look too deeply. But we need to look too deeply. And I think perhaps one of the things that surprises me is, why would Johnson think he could get away with all of these lies? Why would he think that he could be Prime Minister and get away with all of these lies? Because he's looked at previous people who've got away with not as much as him, but have got away with lying about things, there being very, very bad consequences, and us just saying, oh, well, let's just move them on from Prime Minister, give them peerage, give them lots of money, and move on. Now, I don't want to name names, but I think the liar that Johnson takes inspiration for is someone not as good as him. Indeed, we could definitely call him a B liar, I think, probably, in terms of his skills in lying. But I think that's where Johnson's learned it from. And now I think Johnson is surprised that he's starting to feel the heat round his ankles for these lies coming back to haunt him. And I have to say to the British people in general, if you tolerate this, what is going to come next? Because I can see not just a Johnson of the past, I can also see a Johnson of the future waiting in the wings, changing his mind about how his party is run, in the knowledge that whatever he does in the next 18 months, he's likely to become Prime Minister. And I think he will be seeing a similar regime that he can run unless we act now. And that's why, of course, I want to try and encourage everyone in Uxbridge to start raising these questions with both the Conservative and the Labour candidates to try and get some sense of justice and full disclosure over the whole issue of Russian involvement and Boris Johnson.
Jim, we've talked a lot about the internal political dynamics of Brexit, which have been very, very negative. On reflection, do you think that the role of Russian interference, Russian intervention, may have been decisive in the Brexit referendum, or was it only a peripheral phenomenon?
Well, I mean, I think it could well have been very decisive because, as I understand it, the role of Russia in the referendum had to do with its role in manipulating social media and that sort of thing, Cambridge Analytica and so on and so forth. And of course, we know that people use social media much more frequently these days as sources of information than they did in the past, that they get involved in echo chambers and this sort of thing, which results in a dramatic polarization of public opinion. And of course, the other thing that social media does is that it makes it much easier for politicians of the likes of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump to make headway because people are now able through social media to feel that they have they have a direct relationship with these people, if that makes sense. Politicians use social media much more these days in order to establish direct relationships with their voters, to cultivate celebrity status for themselves, and in order and to enable them to appear, as it were, like voters themselves, like the person next door, to create this very strong sense of identification. I mean, it's very, very telling that when people refer to Boris Johnson, many people refer to him using his first name these days, yes? Something
it's not even his first name, it's the name he likes to be known by.
Yes, he, as if he were a mate of theirs down at the party, that sort of thing, I mean, nobody ever referred to Margaret Thatcher as Margaret. Nobody ever referred.
They wouldn't have dared to.
They wouldn't have dared to. You see, so that just sort of makes the point. And all his study, his gaffes, which I think he's learned a lot from people like Silvio Berlusconi. Yes, people used to remark on how gaff prone Berlusconi was. Well, I think a lot of it was very studied, because it enabled him to create this very intimate relationship with the voters he was trying to persuade, and Johnson's learned from that.
You talked about Margaret Thatcher. Lord Carrington was once asked what would happen to the leadership of the Conservative Party if Margaret Thatcher were run over by a bus, to which his answer was, no bus would dare run her over. It's a rather different political background. I think that if we'd been holding such a conversation 3 or 4 years ago, it would have seemed a little bit out of the mainstream. Now, it's very striking that a lot of the things that we've been saying today, not everybody would agree with them by any means, but they're very much nearer to the mainstream of political debate and analysis than they were. And we in Rejoin EU will continue to try and push these ideas even nearer to the mainstream. But thank you very much, all three of you, for your very interesting contributions.
Embark on a majestic journey with the Rejoin EU party and support our cause on Patreon. Be part of the movement.
Vote Rejoin EU. Join the EU vision.